Hello, everyone. Welcome to the Creative Connection series. Today we are with anti-racist art teachers, and I'll pass it over. Oh, and I'm Jocelyn Jeffries. I'm typically the host of various things, including NJGA Presents. I will pass it over to Christina to introduce herself.
Hi, I'm Christina Hill. I'm from Apple Farm Arts and Music Center. I'm our Arts Integration and STEAM Education Director, and I'm excited to be here. I'm going to pass it on over to Abigail to introduce herself.
Hi, my name is Abby Brahanu. I teach high school art in County of St. Louis, Missouri. I've been teaching for 14 years and been lucky enough to work with these ladies and now will since June, and it's been very exciting.
Hi, I'm Dr. Lori Santos, and I'm Associate Professor in Art Education at Wichita State University. Happy to be here.
Hi, I'm Paula Lees, and I'm an elementary art teacher just outside of Washington, D.C.
Hi, I'm Will Kakulis. I'm an elementary art teacher as well in Denver, Colorado.
Hi, everyone. I am Francesca Levy, and I am also an elementary art teacher in Miami, Florida.
Awesome. We have a couple of questions prepped for today, and then as conversations go, it'll just keep vibing. So I'm going to pass it over to Christina.
All right. So I guess since we're all here, let's get started. Tell us about your work and how did you all get started? I was initially like, oh, wait, you're from Colorado and you're from Florida. So I'm curious to know how you all met each other, but how did this all come about?
So I guess I can start. So actually, because of COVID, I found myself back in social media as a way to connect and meet other art educators. And especially I was teaching online for the first time. And I had no idea what I was doing, like many other art educators. So I turned to social media, specifically Facebook groups, to be able to connect with other art educators and get ideas and see what was working well to kind of navigate this new realm of online teaching. And when I was doing that, as the stories of Ahmaud Arbery, Breonna Taylor, George Floyd began to emerge, I noticed that there was a shift in the tone in some of the Facebook groups. And I noticed how some art teachers were posting questionable comments and so some comments such as, I don't see color, elementary students are too young to talk about race, or we need to keep politics out of the classroom. And to me, those comments were problematic. So as I was addressing and having conversations with other art educators online, I began to compile a list of resources that I was sharing. And part of that was art lessons, because one of the things that came out was, oh, elementary teachers, you can't teach this in elementary art. And I was like, yes, you can. I've done it. I know there are other art educators out there. Let's work together and create a resource. So I started reaching out to different art educators who I saw had posted lessons online and asking if they would be willing to collaborate. Originally it was a Google Doc, a collaborative Google Doc so I first reached out to Nyla and Francesca, and from there we sort of grouped together. And I don't know if maybe Francesca wants to talk more about how that went to the next step.
Yeah, so we were, Paulice was really active on Facebook, and I have an art teacher Instagram. And so again, when the murders of Ahmaud Arbery, Breonna Taylor, George Floyd happened, on my personal social media, I was seeing a lot of my friends and, people family members speaking out about the injustice, and they were really outraged. And then I would switch over to my art teacher Instagram, and it was all like rainbows and like everything is great. And I was like, why are art teachers not talking about this? I mean, we all teach students of color. This is so important and relevant. And why is this conversation not happening in this space? So that's when I connected with Paulice and Nyla, and we said, let's just make a little, something to put out there, a message to kind of just get this conversation started and bring it into this, community on Instagram. So that's when we made the messages that they're on the border of this video right now, though. And Paulise is wearing it on her shirt, and so is Abby. The We See Color, we value all students. We took the elements of art and turned them into the elements of anti-racist art teaching. And we made a graphic and we just put it out there into the world. And sort of overnight, we were kind of inundated with art teachers from all over the globe reaching out to us and saying, I really am inspired to do this work. I've never done this type of work before, but I feel that it's important and I have no idea where to start. I'm scared. What do I read? How do I do this? I'm clueless. And we wanted to figure out how to create a resource. So we made our website, antiracistartteachers.org, and we grew that by bringing in other educators that had been doing this work for a long time, like Abby and Lori and Will and Khadijah and Nyla and Tamara that are not on this chat, to all work collaboratively on this website, which is a growing resource for art teachers. If you haven't visited, highly recommend it. And since then, we've just been working more on there are a lot of teachers that want to do this kind of work, but they just don't know where to start. So we want to be that starting place.
So what are some things that you offer as a way of starting with all of this? And then also, everyone in the chat and everyone who's watching, please comment questions, because we want your input. We want to see you through your words.
So I know, you can go ahead, Abby.
Okay, I was just saying, since it is a Facebook Live, we do have a Facebook group page is one place that you can start. It's called Art Teachers for Anti-Racist Curriculum. And that's actually how I met Paulise, who brought me into the group. Because I know one of the things that I've heard teachers say often when I talk about anti-racist curriculum or making your classroom more culturally inclusive or your content more culturally inclusive, it's like, I don't know where to find this information. I didn't learn this way. I wasn't educated this way. So I wanted to start a Facebook group that was just tailored toward finding resources and curriculum resources. So the point of the page, yes, there are anti-racist concepts that we dissect and talk about as a group, but it's intended to have teachers come and share what they have so people can actually put it into action and implement it in the classroom. And Paulise and Francesca and Lori, if you want to take it away on our website.
Yeah, for in terms of resources, one of the first things that we came out with was a starter guide. So just to give our educators a guideline to kind of where to begin. So that first step is to listen, so that we're listening to BIPOC, that we're hearing their stories, and that we're expanding our circles. So on our website, we have lists of resources, podcasts, TED Talks, books, article recommendations for our educators to really start to listen and as well learn, which is the next step from listening. So really learning and understanding the history of racism and systemic racism in America, and knowing that that is an ongoing, lifelong process, that you're not going to read one book and all of a sudden be anti-racist. It is a ongoing process, constantly self-reflecting and reforming, which are the later two steps in their starter guide, to reflect on your curriculum. So really taking a deeper look at your curriculum and at your instruction, and making sure that you're avoiding a biased curriculum and really evaluating not only what you're teaching, but how you're teaching it. And from there, you move on to reformation. So reforming and making changes to your curriculum and instruction, and knowing, again, I said it before, but it's not a start and stop process. It is a circular process where you're constantly going between listening, learning, reflecting, and reforming. So that was one of the first resources we put out.
I'd add to that, not only, that deeper dive into the assessment of your curriculum, but we've talked a lot about, sort of deconstructing yourself and taking a closer look at your own positionality and the intersection of the different aspects of your own life, the people, places, and things that have influenced you, and so that you gain sort of a broader understanding of why it is that you think and believe things a certain way. And so where you can, doing some sort of a mind mapping exercise is something that I often do with my students, to have them basically look into, who they are and why they are who they are, and then they can have a deeper understanding of how that informs their curriculum.
Lori, can I shout out a book? Because I've been buying this for all the young people in my life. I know you love it too, Paula Lee. But everything you're talking about, she has students journaling their positionality. She has them doing a lot of introspection. This book is Anti-Racist by Tiffany Joel. Really great book, and great for young people. It's a young adult read, but I want it for my students, so I wanted to read it myself first.
I love how visually pleasing that book is. When I was feeling overwhelmed by seeing everybody post books, they were, buying and reading, anytime that one comes up, I'm like, oh yeah, that one. It just jumps out at me. I love everything that you guys are saying, and I took a look at your website, and I think it has great resources as a jumping off point. It's sort of like a rabbit hole you can kind of get lost in a good way. I wonder what kind of advice or how would you guide an art teacher who may not have the support of their administration in doing this kind of work, or saying, I want to have an anti-racist art room, and they encounter pushback?
I know Paula Lise and I have talked about this a lot, but one of the things that's really important, and this is sort of whether you have a supportive administration or not, but definitely makes it easier if you don't have a supportive administration, is really making sure that when you are bringing these topics into your classroom, that everything is student-led. It's really important that when you are having discussions about racism or any other topic that has to do with social justice, that you are there as a facilitator and as a guide, but that everything is coming from the students. And that way you don't have a parent going to the administration saying, oh, my child's art teacher said this, and that, because you're not the one who is standing in front of the class saying it to them. It's coming from the students and their own observations from the world. We do a skin color mixing project. And then that kind of just opens up the door. I tell students, the color of our skin, it just has to do with our melanin, but the different colors of our skin means that sometimes we are treated differently in this world. And I just kind of open up the floor for anyone to share their experiences with that. And all of my students, even the very young ones, have sadly experiences with this. And then it becomes a completely student driven conversation. So that's a great way to, it's in the student's hands, and you're just there as a guide and facilitator.
Yeah, I think, and adding on to that a little bit, I think it's important that we keep in mind that we can't wait for our administrators and our families and communities to be ready. Now is the time to take action. Part of our job as educators is to prepare students to enter society, and that society is currently plagued with systemic racism. And by avoiding it for fear of not having that support, and overall just refusing to have a dialogue about race, it's not going to resolve the issues. It's just going to continue to perpetuate it. So it is really important. Don't wait. Because if you're waiting for permission, you're not going to receive it. Just take action now.
I think, I'm sorry.
Oh no, go ahead.
I think also you can use, a lot of BIPOC artists talk about their racial identity. Not to say every BIPOC artist is talking about race, but if you're brown and Black, you have experiences in the world, generally, especially if you live in Europe and the United States. A lot of experiences with race, and that comes out sometimes in your work, like Kerry James Marshall. It's something that is very prominent in his work, Kendi Wiley. So you can use artist work, it's not your voice, it's the artist. You can't talk about Kendi Wiley's work without talking about representation and the lack of representation in museums and power, how, Black skin often wasn't presented in a way that has power and shows power. And that's what his work is about. And so I think for me, I've always, because I've kind of taught in a community, my administrator is supportive, thankfully, but my community, I'm always kind of careful, treading carefully, but I think if somebody came after me and said, how dare you teach this? How dare I teach Kendi Wiley? I mean, he's a very prominent artist today, and I'm an art teacher. I think the argument is there. So just using artist voice also to teach it in addition to student voice, Francesca, because that's definitely where it has to start.
Absolutely. So we have a comment from Lawrence Levy. I know teachers have asked you to create posters without the term anti-racist because they aren't comfortable with the label, mostly because they don't consider themselves to be racist. How do you respond to that?
So I have a couple strong opinion on this, and I think the fact that the term anti-racist has become politicized is I take issue with. Same with the way that the term Black Lives Matter has also become politicized and kind of seen in a negative way. And I think that it's really important, and I'm going to read the quote from Ibram X. Kendi's book, How to Be Anti-Racist. So the opposite of racist is not racist. It's anti-racist. What's the difference? One endorses the idea of a racial hierarchy as a racist, or racial equality as an anti-racist. One either believes problems are rooted in groups of people as a racist, or locates the roots of problems in powers and policies as an anti-racist. One either allows racial inequities to preserve as a racist, or confronts racial inequities as an anti-racist. There's no in-between safe space of not racist. And I think that quote is really important, because it speaks to the idea that we need action, and that inaction is compliance. By choosing to not actively work against the system, that you're just being complicit in that system that continues to perpetuate systemic racism.
Yeah, for background, that's my mom on my dad's Facebook that asked that question, which is why I laughed, because we actually did get that request, and I remember after we posted these images, and just Paul, Lise, and Nyla and I were just like totally like, how is this? This just misses the point completely by asking us to take off anti-racist. So that's my mom. Hi.
Well, thank you, Francesca's mom and dad. Thank you, Lauren. So you mentioned that it becomes politicized. So what do you say to teachers who are like, oh, I don't want to bring politics into the classroom. Oh, I don't. And then parents who say that too, where I don't want you bringing politics and teaching my kid about the other side or whatever. How do you guys respond to that?
Yeah, I think this goes back to our original question with kind of how you go about teaching this. In general, I mean, as teachers, it's important that we don't, impose our views to students. Like, I had lots of students ask me during the election, Miss Levy, who are you voting for? Who are you voting for? And I wouldn't tell them, because I feel like that, crosses a professional boundary. But when it comes to this isn't, I'm not standing in the front of the classroom, like reading, a political manifesto. This is a conversation about things that are happening in our country, in our community, and to students in our very own classroom. I'm sure the majority of teachers teach Black and Brown students, or have taught Black and Brown students, or will teach Black and Brown students. So this is not like a political issue. And if you're really, really worried about that, then start out by, again, having student-driven and student-centered conversations, so that it's not, again, the teacher standing in front of the classroom, indoctrinating students, letting the student voices. And then what Abby said about you're teaching artists. I mean, we're art teachers, and regardless of, your comfort level with diving into these types of conversations right now, every single art teacher should be teaching BIPOC artists. I mean, if your entire art curriculum is all white artists, then you're definitely, doing something wrong. So like Abby said, not all BIPOC artists make art about, being people of color, but many do. And that's important to their work. And we're art teachers, and we teach about artists and why they make art. So it's not political, it's art.
But teaching is political. Teaching is political. I went to school and all I learned about were white people and centering whiteness and feeling like my people have contributed nothing to human civilization. And in fact, if anything, all I was taught was that I was a burden on society. We are teaching our kids, not just through our content, our behavior, the biases that we bring in our classroom, all that is there to maintain white supremacy and power, truthfully, So our education system is systemically racist as it is, And so it is politically like that. It's intentional. So while we don't talk about our political affiliations in terms of partisanship or anything like that, at the end of the day, like if you believe you teach in a racist system, which we do, then the only way to dismantle it is by going counter against it, right? And so, yes, you can't, I mean, in my community, I think I would get in trouble for standing in front of a classroom, unfortunately, Pauline, because Black Lives Matter has been politicized being like Black Lives Matter. But I can say Black Lives Matter, teach Black Lives Matter, teach my kids that brown and Black people are valuable and they've contributed a lot to the world we live in, and that we need to acknowledge their contributions and what in my content, So if people are afraid of politics, you're either participating in white supremacy right now, or you're going to go against it. You're participating in either, So. Lori, Will.
That's pretty powerful. Well, I just keep in my mind. I think about, as art educators, we talk so much about how art is about the human experience, and I don't feel like it's politicizing it, because this is in our agenda to teach the truth and to tell the story of all people. And if you're leaving, I guess if you think of the grand book of art and the history of humanity, and if you have a few chapters missing, there's something from the story that just doesn't translate, I guess, for all of us, because there's something missing if we're leaving out particular stories from particular people. I don't know. I try to use metaphors, I guess, like that when I talk to my students, because often they don't. I feel like I work with pre-service students, and so often they come to the classroom, I feel, thinking that all children are the same, that they're coming from a context of they've learned the masters, the greats, we can't. I suppose Michelangelo, Da Vinci, we can list all those great artists. And then I ask them to list women artists, to list BIPOC artists. And they're hard pressed to come up with artists. And it, it sort of saddens me because that's only one little piece of the story, Michelangelo and Da Vinci. And it doesn't devalue. We're not trying to devalue those other artists, but that's just one little piece of the story.
Piggybacking off of everybody else, I was the last one to join the group of anti-racist art teachers. It all kind of like goes back to, I believe that even though telling history is kind of hard, whether it's going through elementary school, middle school, or high school, or even into college, they still need to know the truth. They need to know what happened. They need to know that, not just these greats that were the main focus of the time, but there were also other artists that were of color who get recognition that those greats did. And like with myself being Native American, I find it hard that Native culture is not being told properly, and the artwork is not being expressed properly. We're not extinct. But again, like everything like comes with a certain plan. And nowadays there's the mascot issue, and a lot of people are getting away from that. There's different artists that depict that same thing and show that we're not that. But I mean, for anyone, black or brown or any color, ethnicity, whatever it is, their history isn't always the main focus. The main focus is that white European focus. And yes, maybe the conqueror is the one that wins, but you know what? The one who was conquered always, I believe, has the right to have their voice spoken for too.
I have a question that might be like a really big question, but I'm curious, something I think about a lot, and we run a summer program where, as a year-round staff person, we talk a lot about how we struggle to hire a staff that reflects our campers, and we're a fine and performing arts summer program, and I remember hearing a statistic, I think it's like 79, 80% of art teachers are white. And I wonder a lot about that. And I saw that in the questions that Arts at New Jersey put together, one of them was about opportunities and mentorship for BIPOC students and becoming art educators. But I just wonder if you could talk a little bit about that, because it blows my mind personally, and I'm sure I don't know. I have questions.
I'd like to say a little bit to that. I mean, I think that what you're talking about really is another extension of the systemic racist curriculum that we have. If students don't see themselves in the curriculum, if you're not showing them artists, BIPOC artists, how can they envision themselves as an artist? So that's something that needs to be addressed. I know for me, as a director of a art education program, I do specifically think about recruitment, and we are working towards and have put together events where we particularly invite students of color to come in and visit the campus and have access. Sometimes it's about access. That's if students aren't given the opportunity and access, they don't know where they can go or where they can fit. And if you look historically at how admissions advisors have directed students of color, you'll often find that sort of steering them towards professional careers or careers in education Many years ago, that was not the case. Let's hope that it is changing, but it's not something that we can not continue to be aware of. You know, if I'm a young brown or black girl going into the advising office and I'm interested in art, is that advisor going to see or, you know, and help me move towards that sort of a career, you know?
Yeah, I think in general, art has always existed as we know it in our country, as in a very privileged space and in a very white space. I mean, not art as a whole. People, BIPOC people all over the world have been making art forever, but the way that we know it in our country right now, it's usually reserved for the very wealthy. I mean, I live in Miami. Art Basel happens here every year. It's this like insane show of wealth and yachts and celebrities all flocking to art. It's, you know, art collectors, and art museums are very often like white and privileged space. They often cost a lot of money to get into. I remember when I don't want to misquote the statistic, but when I was in grad school, I read an article asking how many Black teenagers, youth in America had ever visited an art museum before. And the number was shockingly low, not because they, you know, couldn't afford to or weren't interested in it, but because those spaces felt exclusionary. So I think that as art educators and people in the art world, many of art teachers are also artists. We really need to examine sort of the whiteness of the art world and why it's so exclusionary to people of color.
We have a comment from the chat. Born Earth says, big time about access and white supremacy. As a white educator, I've experienced the gatekeepers when, and as a Black educator, as a Black educator, I have experienced the gatekeepers when I pursued art certification as well as in graduate school.
Can I speak to that? Actually, is what I was going to say. And I share these stories not to get pity, but I think one of the ways to dismantle racism is like prove to people it exists, right? But my high school counselor discouraged me from becoming an artist. In fact, I'd run out of art classes to take because I loved it. I had a very encouraging art teacher. I had a lot of support, especially as an art educator going through school. But he tried to push me into a child development class because he said, you're likely to have a child. His words, it stuck with me forever, but you're not likely going to become an artist, were his words to me. So I had to like push through all of that. I know it's shocking, but you have to hear it. You know, these are conversations, and to speak to what this person just said, I completely relate. There are gatekeepers, especially because they haven't grown up seeing Black artists. And honestly, as I was making these paintings in high school and college, all the artists that came to mind were Vincent van Gogh, Matisse. Like, I didn't know any artists of color, not one, not Jacob Lawrence, not Aaron Douglas. And these are big ones that I should have at least learned about, right? Charles White, didn't learn about him, you know? And so I just think, yeah, it was really hard for me to even believe I could become an artist, you know? And then you have those other gatekeepers along the way telling you it's not for you, you know? So I think if we target mentorship, it's what Lori said. We need to, and Francesca, we need to question the institutions, the educational institutions, the museums that are they allowing access and opportunity for artists and student artists, young artists to see themselves as artists, and to also encourage them and give them mentorship into those roles because they're hearing that they can't do it.
You just reminded me of something I hadn't thought about in ages, which is when I was in like one of my first jobs, I was a teaching artist in New York City in the South Bronx, and we used to bring our students to a museum. I'm not going to sell the museum out, but I remember when I was like getting trained to give tours, they were like, oh, well, it's pay what you can, but we don't advertise that. So don't tell your students that because then their families will come. And I remember thinking like, That's the weirdest thing I ever heard. And I hadn't thought about that in ages. And then when you were saying about access to museums and whatnot, I didn't even, it's like, yeah. And what to get in is like $25, but it's pay what you can. But it's just such an interesting barrier that is unfortunate. And I cut Jocelyn off. I'm sorry, you were going to say something.
Oh, no, it's fine. So I was just going to comment that as a student who has grown up in art, and specifically I think about like language arts, like when you said a Black artist or a person of color is an artist, I was like racking my brain and I couldn't think of any which were visual artists, but I immediately thought of Langston Hughes, and that is it, which is a problem. And then he spoke mainly of just the Black experience, which is obviously extraordinarily valid. But to like what you said earlier, where people worry about politicizing the classroom, these people are humans. People of all colors are humans who have millions of experiences that can relate to every single person. And so it's obvious that the system isn't trying hard enough to have all of these people who are humans having these experiences and may just have different colors of their skin, because they are talking about other things which aren't necessarily political, though deeming an entire group of people's experience as political is ridiculous.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
So I would like to hear a little bit of more artists that you guys love talking about, and ones that really I don't know, light your flame and really get you excited to talk about this topic with students.
Well, I do want to preface it by just saying that representing diverse artists in your curriculum is only a small part of being anti-racist and anti-bias. I don't want people to think that, that just by representing diverse artists in my classroom, I'm no longer anti-racist, because that's not what it is at all. It's just a small part, and it also needs to be more than a symbolic effort. And our educators really need to take into account intersectionality when introducing these artists to their students. And also, I use a lot of artwork to spark critical conversations in the art room. So you can have a conversation with students about racism or about systemic injustices by having them discuss a work of art. So artists such as Ai Weiwei is just one example, or Kadir Nelson, showing their art and having students talk about their work and what they see as a segue to be able to have those conversations in the classroom, I think is really important.
The website has lots of great artists on there for teachers to explore. But I think what becomes more interesting for me, along with obviously the representation, but are those issues that you spoke of, Paula-Lise, that, it's really having our students investigate the bigger questions about injustices and our humanity as people, and using art as that tool to have those conversations. And just so happens that a lot of BIPOC artists, yes, do address those things, but some of them don't. Another thing I'd like to remind teachers is to be careful to not sort of pigeonhole or use one artist as representation for all. That, again, back to that sort of intersectionality of one's identity needs to be examined, because you can't use one singular Black artist or Native American artist to speak for all of a group of people.
Also, something I'm questioning recently. Lori, did I cut you off? I thought.
Oh, no. I just wanted to pause to give someone else an opportunity to.
Something that I was gonna say something that I'm questioning a lot recently is the aesthetics that I'm sharing with my kids. It's very European, right? And Lisa Butler has an awesome video that I'll find sometime here. Apologies, I know you're really quick with your fingers there. But she, talks a lot in her art. She uses what she calls Kool-Aid colors, and she feels like going through she went through Howard, and at Howard they were trying to dismantle white supremacy through dismantling white European aesthetics, and which, speaks to a limited color palette, diluting the intensity of colors, these things, or placing in a hierarchy. We have a hierarchy in art. What we consider as European art tends to be fine art, and then everybody else's art, brown and black, Asian, all of us are in the artifact categories of the art museums often, and labeled as craft. And so just questioning that aesthetic, even when we're talking about composition and the elements and principles of design. I teach the elements and I teach the principles. However, just being very strategic in the way I introduce them, being more focused on process over the product, because that's when the real beauty happens anyway. So grading on the process versus what ends up happening at the end, because what am I basing my assessment on really at this point? European aesthetics. So I have to really be careful in introducing my kids to art in that way too. Like, this is the right way to make art. And so that's something I'm really working on myself, because it's really hard because it's all I know. So I have to go back to my Ethiopian roots and think about why my people made art the way they did, because they didn't have those introductions, so.
You spoke right to my heart. I just finished teaching a process art class to my middle schoolers, and I essentially taught them my pre-K process art curriculum, just as we're coming back from COVID, they're coming back to school, and they just need to exist and create. And it was the best experience, and being able to just assess them on process over product was so freeing for me, and I think for them as well. And that does make a lot of sense. I didn't really think about who you're comparing things to, or what the standard you're holding their artwork to. I have another question. I saw a graphic today where you kind of talked about appropriation, and I feel like that comes up a lot, at least in my circle. I feel like it gets talked about. We just had Indigenous People Day at school, and there was a lot of conversation about what is appropriation versus what is education, and if it's taught sensitively, is this okay? And there were a lot of great conversations, and I'm glad that we have educators that feel compelled to ask these questions and to break it down rather than just doing something. I think that in itself is great, but I just wonder if you could speak more to that, the difference between appreciation and appropriation, and how to even just navigate as a supervisor, navigating those conversations, or as teachers who are teaching, navigating those conversations. That's a lot of questions in one, I'm sorry.
I think that the idea of appropriation is something that's, again, systemically ingrained in us as art educators. If you look at the tradition of westernized art schooling, it's based on copy. And so we're taught to copy everything. And what happens when we then, and then let me also say, I think from my perspective, that sometimes with particular reasons, there's certain modes of, I guess, what we could call copying for skill development or research, but not to steal and create and claim as your own. And that's where things get kind of sticky and dangerous when we then translate this over to cultures that might be different from our own. Now, all of a sudden, we feel like we have the right to sort of copy and, maybe even think of it as plagiarism. I was talking about this recently with my students in the classroom, because some of them were kind of questioning and not quite getting this idea, well, what is cultural appropriation? But when I started talking about it as plagiarism, cultural plagiarism, cultural rape, even, to get really assertive about it. All of a sudden, some lights started going off, and it made a little bit more sense to them. I think I saw Will was wanting to say something earlier.
Oh yeah, so I think kind of piggybacking off of that. I mean, if you look at Picasso, he did a bunch of cultural appropriations with African masks. In basically a lot of his work. And talking about Indigenous Peoples Day, this is kind of how I got the jump in with this group. There was a post that somebody was talking about recreating glass corn, and they were doing it with beads, and they weren't really. To me, it didn't seem like there was really much information that was being presented for the activity, and I just started asking questions to this person and to everybody in the group, and then there's always those people who are, oh, he's just trying to get a rise out of everybody. But being Native American myself, it's like, do you really understand what you're doing? Do you understand what you're really saying to the kids? So it's going back on that. It's just like, do you really understand the true thing of what you're doing?
Yeah, there's certain knowledges and rites of passage, ways of knowing that come into using those certain types of images and symbols. It's if one example I've often used with my students is like with Hopi Kachina dolls. If it's not appropriate for Hopi children to make those things, why is it appropriate for our children to make it?
I think that a way that I have had conversations with teachers that I have seen them do things that I think were cultural appropriation, but they were, they were doing it unknowingly, was I've always kind of tried to show interest in their project and sort of ask them, can you tell me more about, for example, if they're doing a math project, or the for Dia de los Muertos, those sugar skulls, and kind of ask them, do you know more about where this comes from? I'm curious, I'm interested. And then that can open up a conversation, especially if they are aware of the fact that this thing that they're making with children has like a religious meaning, or a ritual meaning that's very sacred to the culture. Then that can open the door for a conversation about, like, is this really respecting the culture if this object that you're making with the students is normally very sacred? Like, is it respectful to have, all of your second graders like scribbling this for fun? So that's just a really, that's a big one that I see a lot with cultural appropriation. That's sort of a lot of the times the line for it can be blurry. We get a lot of like teachers reaching out to us saying, I want to do this project inspired by this culture, or inspired by this group of people, or this type of folk art. Like, is it cultural appropriation if I do it? And always the first like red flag is, okay, well, how do the people of that culture use the thing that you want to make? And if they're using it in a way that's sacred to their culture, then that's a definite no. And that's a really easy way to start that conversation.
Yeah. And with that, I was recently asked a question about this conversation. Somebody had stated that oh, this is only going to make art teachers not want to do the work if they're not, so the question was like, oh, well, if teachers have to do all of this research, then they're just not going to want to do the work and teach about other cultures. And to that, I say, I would rather you not teach about other cultures if you're not willing to put in the work to do the research and to be able to understand it yourself before you're teaching children, because otherwise you're likely going to just continue to perpetuate stereotypes and misinformation. So if you're not, you need to first, as an educator, know and understand what you're teaching before you start to teach it.
Mm-hmm.
Absolutely. So with that, do we have any more comments before we move on to our last question of this very informative and interesting stream?
So can I add to what I'm sorry, Will.
No, you're good. I was just going to comment to the comment that came up from Kim. You're right. He gave no credit. There was no credit given, and it wasn't just him. It was all these masters that gave no credit that they stole from.
Yeah. Abby and I were talking about that the other day, like with Matisse as well. So
yeah, Matisse and Japanese prints. You could teach that. That's the thing. I teach about, these European artists. I love them. I love Matisse's art, but I also talk about the context of teaching, making sure that you see the connection. I put a side by side of Hiroshige's work, Hakuse's work, and some of the more famous printmakers, and show them the connection of. They have to make comparisons and find those comparisons, and then they see it right away. Oh, like the way they display space, it's bird's eye view. His is too. And look at the color schemes. He's using mainly blues and reds, and so finding that connection. The same will with Picasso, looking at West African masks and looking at Picasso's work. And so you can still teach about these artists. We've talked about this when we say anti-racist curriculum. It's like, well, are you going to wipe out all the masters? I don't call them masters, but they were great artists. They had, in their own right, but why were they the ones recognized? Like you said, Will, there were people of color all over the world making art, and then that gives you an opportunity to talk about institutions and how they didn't allow access to women and people of color. And then you talk about now power dynamics, power, it's about power, maintaining power and white supremacy, and one thing I was going to add, Pauline, what did you say? I was going to say something to what you were saying, and now it's gone. But
before Will's comment, I said, about teachers not wanting to do the work and the research.
Yeah, research. Okay. Somebody, and we should have this on our website. Somebody on our website on Art Teachers for Anti-Racist Curriculum, the group page, join it. Did a lesson on cultural appropriation. Lori is like the queen of this, by the way. About cultural appropriation, but do a lesson on it. Okay, let's do research. Go wherever you want in the world and look up artwork that you enjoy and do research. What do you notice about it? What are your takeaways? How could you be inspired by your research and what you studied and not co-opt that culture, And before doing that, you teach about cultural appropriation, So, and then you teach your kids what are elements that you can be inspired by in that work, where you don't copy those patterns, you don't copy exactly what's there. It could be the colors. It could be the subject matter, maybe, that influenced you. We talked about Day of the Dead being about legacy, So that's a wonderful way to honor someone's legacy when they have passed, and every year to remember it. That's really the big picture, the big idea in Day of the Dead, And so teaching your kids to be inspired, to value other people, because you have to, I don't believe in saying don't teach it, because you have to learn that brown and black people, the global majority, made contributions to human society, the whole of human civilization. They have to know that, but then teaching them how to not appropriate, because it comes so naturally for them already, because they are like the Pinterest generation. They go on and copy everything already anyway. So you're killing two birds with one stone. You're teaching them, like you said, Lori, about plagiarism. It is plagiarism, and how to process inspiration versus just taking what you see and making it your own, right? So.
Yeah. And the lesson, I don't know if someone can put it out, but the lesson was by Chloe Walker, but it's on our website as well, but it's on appropriation versus appreciation. So shout out to Chloe Walker.
So with that, does anyone have any more comments before we move on to our outro? Okay, so thank you so much for coming on. Be sure, thank you everyone in the audience for participating. Please go check out their website. I will put the name under while everyone is saying goodbye, so you can go and you can check it out, and have a blessed night, and stay safe, and have the happiest of holidays.
Yes, thank you all. And we also, if you want to follow us on Instagram, we're at Anti-Racist Art Teachers. And we also have a Facebook page, which is Anti-Racist Art Teachers, and the Facebook group, Art Teachers for an Anti-Racist Curriculum. All right. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Thank you. Bye.